If someone had told me at my husband's funeral that the woman sitting in the front row would be handed the keys to my home and my life, I would have laughed, and then I would have broken down on the spot. Instead, I stood there in a charcoal coat, watching my son thank the woman who had been living in the holes of my marriage, and felt the floor fall out from under me. I remember how the chapel looked that morning. The rain so steady it seemed like someone had left a soft, gray curtain across the stained glass windows. Lilies filled the air with that green, clean smell that always makes people quiet. I kept my hands folded because I was afraid if I did anything else they might tremble visibly. My husband William's coat, his charcoal coat, was wrapped around me like an old habit. He always said it made me look dignified. In that moment, I clung to the coat like a lifeline. Daniel, my son, 33 and sharp as a new knife with code and algorithms, walked to the podium. I'd watched him grow from a tiny boy who used to fall asleep with his head on my shoulder to a man who could calmly stand in a room and make his voice soft enough to command attention. He had the cadence you'd expect from someone who builds systems for a living, measured, efficient, practiced. He began his tribute the way people do at funerals, the soft recollections, the careful praise, the gestures toward a life that seemed, outwardly, complete. I listened for the words I most wanted to hear. I waited, silly, hopeful motions like holding onto a phrase someone has yet to speak. And then he said it. "There's someone I want to thank," he said, and he paused in a way that made every head in the room tilt. Someone who was truly family to my father. He didn't look at me when he said it. His eyes were fixed on the front row. For a second, one suspended second, I thought he was talking about me. I thought, for a breath, that all the nights of soup and late meetings, the dime-pinching budgets and phone calls to pediatricians, might finally be named. But his gaze settled on her. Cassandra Hale, slender, in an emerald dress that hugged her like a secret. Tears on her cheeks, perfectly timed. The name unfolded across the room like a ribbon. She stood, nodded, wiped her cheeks as if anybody had practiced grief for public performance, and my world, my place in it, changed before my eyes. 2 days later, I sat in a downtown law office with the scent of old wood and brass, and I watched as paper could do what words at the funeral had suggested: erase me. The lawyer read the will. The paragraphs clicked through like a verdict. Pursuant to the last will and testament of Mr. William Parker, dated 3 years prior, the majority of Mr. Parker's assets, including his primary residence in Burlington, Vermont, the summer cottage in Provincetown, Cape Cod, and the remaining balance of his accounts, shall be inherited by Ms. Cassandra Hale. The room tasted like metal. I heard my heartbeat in the hinges of the law office door. Cassandra's name, the sound of it, came at me again, this time inked on paper. My knees forgot how to be legs. I looked at Daniel as if I could burn a question into his face. He sat straight-backed, his fingers folded, his eyes level and impassive. There wasn't the flicker of surprise or remorse I had somehow hoped for. It was as if he had rehearsed the expression since childhood. The lawyer kept reading. Mrs. Evelyn Parker is to receive a small trust of $5,000, designated as a gesture of acknowledgement. A gesture. $5,000. The word gesture lodged in my throat like a stone. After decades of tending a household, closing my career for motherhood, and sitting by William's side while he did deals and climbed, my life, our life, was reduced to an emblematic check. I left that office with my name still attached to my mailbox, but not to anything that felt like security. The streets of Burlington, which had always felt like mine, the bakery with the warm rye, the corner bookstore, the bench on Church Street where Daniel had first learned to tie his shoes, looked like someone else's postcard. When I got home, grief wrapped itself around me, thick and dull. But beneath the grief there was a hot, rising dread. It began like a small thing, an itch behind the teeth, and quickly became something that demanded action. Cleaning William's desk one quiet afternoon, I found a slim folder tucked beneath tax forms. Stapled to the edges of the papers were envelopes addressed, not to William, but to Cassandra Hale. Letters from a property management company in Provincetown, invoices for landscaping, correspondence about repairs, notices about mail forwarding. Pages that spoke in the bureaucratic voice of people who value keys and roofs and title papers more than feelings. When I read them, a slow, cold burn unfurled in my chest. He'd given her a cottage by the sea. He had been buying her something while we were pinching pennies for Daniel's college. I remembered the year of his long business travel, the nights he came home smelling faintly of someone else's cooking. I remembered Christmas, where I was sick in bed with my knee, and a helper had come to put up the outside lights. I had assumed it was a helpful neighbor boy. Helen, my neighbor, who had watched our block longer than either of us, reminded me differently when I finally told her what I had found. "Oh, Cassandra," Helen said slowly, the word like a breadcrumb on a table already set with memory. "He took her to concerts. I always thought she was some cousin." She squinted then, as if piecing together a puzzle that had been in front of her for years. "I remember that winter you were laid up. It was a woman who helped him. I thought you had a relative." The memory cork popped out of the bottle. I felt like a person who had been reading a story with a missing chapter and suddenly found the pages. All those small silences, you know the kind. The doorway left empty, the late-night calls taken in a car, came together into a pattern I had refused to see for years. I needed someone practical. Not someone to bandage an emotional wound, but someone to look at the ledger of a life and say plainly, "This is not right." So I called Susan Hart, an old colleague from my consulting days, one of the few women who had stayed in the business when I phased out of it. Susan had been a rare ally in our world of men and ties. She had refused the polite invisibility business sometimes offered to women like us. When I told her about the letters and the cottage, she listened for a very long time. Then she said, in that no-nonsense voice I remembered from meetings, "If he put corporate money into this, that's not just betrayal, it's fraud." That word, fraud, was oddly clarifying. It turned hurt into a map. Susan helped me dig. She pulled old spreadsheets, dusted off old login credentials, and we began to follow the money with the obsession of people who have nothing left to lose. Hidden in lines labeled consulting support were transfers to a company name I'd never heard, Seabreeze Consulting LLC. No real office, no staff, no website, just a name on a ledger. The dates of those transfers matched times I had been told William was working late, when I had been home with a fever or helping Daniel pack for college. When we matched one transfer to the time frame of my knee surgery and another to the initial down payment on our Burlington house 20 years ago, Susan's finger trembled on the screen. "You want to pursue this?" she asked. The weight of discovery sits on both shoulders, the ability to ruin reputations and the responsibility to be right. "Yes," I said. There was a certain relief to answering out loud. Not because I wanted court drama, but because silence had been the worst enemy of truth for too long. Susan connected me with Monica Reynolds, an attorney with a reputation for being meticulous and fierce in equal measure. Monica's office had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked over the skyline, and she greeted me with a handshake that made me feel immediately as if I were in competent hands. Documents were copied, affidavits were structured, and Monica began the slow, methodical work of turning a family wound into a legal claim. We hired Ethan Cole, a forensic accountant who liked numbers the way some people like novels. Ethan cut through the plausible deniability, those soft-phrased invoices and consultant memos, and found line after line that didn't add up. Invoices that should have been backed by receipts had none. Paperwork that supposedly came from a vendor had been filled out by a person whose phone trace placed them at Cassandra's Provincetown address. While Monica filed the suit, I did the scariest work a person can do after betrayal. I told my story out loud. I wrote down everything I'd sacrificed. The night I sold my grandmother's emerald brooch so Daniel could have his first semester paid for. The dinners I cooked while he studied for his SATs. The job I left, the colleagues I said goodbye to, the identity I gave up under the quiet assumption that what we were building together was worth the trade. I wrote it until the pen ran out, and I realized how much of myself I had surrendered. Daniel's distance widened. The moment I told him we were pursuing a case, he had a look on his face I could not read, half apology, half determination. When I finally confronted him in the little cafe where he used to eat caramel tarts as a kid, He arrived in a beige trench, his phone already face down, meaning he was trying to be present. I had rehearsed the conversation for nights, imagined scenarios where he would take my hand and say, "Mom, I had no idea." What I got instead was a reply as clinical as the code he writes. "You can file suit, sure," he said, stirring his coffee the way he always did, small circles, but Dad made his decisions. He wanted her to be taken care of. "You can't undo that." He was trying to sound pragmatic. "Don't make this harder," but his words landed like cold rain. "Do you know what I gave up to be here?" I asked him then. I told him about the ring, about the late nights balancing budgets, about how I had thought that love looked like care and constancy. His face hardened. "You always bring the ring up like I owe you something," he said. I felt each word as if it were a small cut. The boy who used to hide under my kitchen table during thunderstorms had grown into a man who preferred the clarity of his father's logic over the messy, inconvenient truth of the woman who raised him. But I had a choice then that I had never faced before: sink into bitterness or do something that made the world accept the truth. I chose the latter. Discovery in a court case is messy. It is also intimate. We subpoenaed bank statements, demanded emails, and sat through depositions that made me feel like I was picking scabs to find the bone beneath. There were long, weary nights where I would place a folder on my kitchen table and weep, and then in the morning pick the folder up and work. Susan called me more than once and said, in that way friends do when they are both practical and kind, "Eve, you need to eat. You're not going to get through this if you don't." Ethan produced a timeline. Transfers from Parker and Associates to Seabreeze Consulting timed just when William had told me he'd been on business trips. Monica tied those transfers to fabricated invoices. The defense attorney, a man with a silver tongue, attempted to paint Cassandra as an independent consultant, a woman who offered companionship and occasional advice in exchange for legitimate payment. When we sat in the courtroom for the trial, I felt both small and massive at once. I was a single woman with a binder of truth across from polished lawyers and a woman who had, in this town, been portrayed as a loyal companion. I was nervous. I was exhausted. But I was no longer willing to be invisible. When Monica called me to the stand and asked me to tell the story of my life with William, I could have faltered. Instead, something steadied me. Maybe it was the months of evidence collection, or the faces of the woman who had once lent me casseroles while my knee healed. Or perhaps, finally, it was the knowledge that there was value in truth. I told the jury about the 1,000 tiny betrayals that had become a pattern. I told them about how I sold something irreplaceable so Daniel could go to school. I told them about the Christmases and the Sunday dinners, the nights of illness I tended, and then the small moments where William's attention slipped away. I spoke about the funeral, about sitting in that damp chapel and feeling the social erasure as my son thanked Cassandra. Monica laid out the financial trail with quiet, devastating clarity. Ethan explained how fabricated invoices were structured and how money had been routed through Seabreeze to hide its final destination. The defense lawyer tried to make Cassandra sympathetic. She had smiles at her photographs, letters from community groups where she'd volunteered, but the ledger does not lie. Numbers, when held up to the light, show the shadow where intention hides. After hours of testimony, after witnesses and cross-examinations, the Judge Rosalind Carter, a woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense stare and the faintest smile at the corners of her mouth, gave her ruling. Her voice was steady. The judge ordered that Cassandra must return the funds that had been taken, more than $1 million with interest. She called the transfers a misuse of company funds and noted the fraudulent nature of the invoices. Victory in court felt, at first, like someone opening a window in a long, closed room. The air was fresher. But legal victory is not the same as emotional restoration. The town's whispers are a curious thing. Some people were relieved to see justice served. Others saw only spectacle. Cassandra's social invitations dried up. Work colleagues stopped calling. The Provincetown cottage, which had once been presented as a joyful retreat, was listed for sale as the judgment forced asset liquidation. For me, there was no cinematic reclaiming of a lost marriage. The house in Burlington still echoed. William's clothes still hung in the closet. A certain absence remained like a place on a map where a city used to be. Daniel refused to speak to me for months. He told coworkers at the firm, where William had been well known, that I had embarrassed the family. He wanted to stand with the memory of his father as he had kept it, not with the messy truth his father had actually lived. Years slipped by. I learned to fill my days with small things again: planting, volunteering at the public library, sitting on the bench near the farmer's market watching people hurry with their brown paper bags. One winter morning, my own father, who had been a quiet, steadfast presence all my life, passed away. I was afraid I would be alone at the funeral. I was not. I looked up and saw Daniel standing at the back of the chapel, pale and exhausted, and carrying a look that looked like remorse. He came to sit beside me after the service. The first apology was small and raw. "Mom," he said, "I'm sorry." He told me he had been wrong to shut the door, to react out of loyalty when he should have asked questions. He had been raised with an image of his father that left no room for mistakes. But grief is funny. It pulls the blinders down and then sometimes, eventually, lets you put them up again. We started slowly. First with short texts, then a phone call. He asked about the trial, not angrily now, but curious. He wanted to know why I had done it. I told him everything. He heard not only the evidence we had proved, but the life I had lived, the days I had chosen to stay at home, the nights of spreadsheets and budgeting, the ring I had sold. Forgiveness, where it came, was not cinematic. It was in small gestures: a shared meal, a visit to the garden, an afternoon helping me clear leaves from gutters. It took time, literally years. But we did rebuild, piece by piece, each conversation a brick carefully placed. On the day I finally felt truly myself again, I walked into the garden behind the Burlington house. The crab apple tree William and I had planted decades earlier stood in ridiculous bloom, branches heavy with white and pink blossoms. I remembered a year I had nearly cut it down, convinced it was dying. But there it was, a stubborn, beautiful return. There is a line people say sometimes: you can't go back. I would add something to that. You can't put the same life back in place, but you can build a new one that belongs to you. I learned that strength is not the ability to give everything without complaint. It is knowing what to keep for yourself. The years I spent trying to be everything to everyone had taught me how to hold the quiet and the loud. I had become, slowly and with some pain, the woman who could tell her own story and expect to be heard. If you're watching this because you felt invisible, because someone you trusted took a piece of your life and pretended it never happened, know this: you are not defined by their choices. You are defined by what you do with the truth when it comes into your hands. If my story moved you at all, please hit like, subscribe if you want to hear more real-life stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your words help me remember that after silence, connection can bloom again. If this story touched you, please like the video, subscribe for more real-life true story narrations, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and whether you've ever had to fight for your name. Share this with someone who needs to know they aren't alone.